Sorry. I hate to feel like I'm preaching from the dark corner. If there's going to be a dark corner, it should probably be the sermon instead of just a dark corner. So, thank you. I'm here all week. As we look at the call of these disciples, it's difficult to see anything special about these particular guys that Jesus called, except for their willingness to serve, to drop everything and go. That itself is, I think, the most unusual thing. Now, if you were going to build a great church, what would you do? Who would you go for? What were you looking at? I don't think I would go down to the pier in Ventura to look for, top-notch disciples. Those aren't where the highest echelons of society tend to hang out. No offense to those. If you are fishermen, sorry, Steve. I know a few of you are fishermen. Kind of common folks are there, right? I mean, that's who's there. If it were me looking for disciples, I think I would start with a terrific singer and musician. Start out there, and maybe somebody that was kind of youngish and smooth and could deliver a great dynamic message. I'd really start. This church building thing is it's a strategic matter. One should take it seriously. You can't waste your choices, right? I mean, instead of calling the common, I would have started with maybe a headhunter. Say, who's the best? Who's the most successful and who's the most likely to succeed? That's who I would do. But Jesus is exactly the opposite. He chooses fishermen. He even did it in kind of an ordinary way. I mean, I think I'd have been ready with my pamphlets and maybe my motivational speech and my flip charts, or now I'd had Joe or Val there with my PowerPoints, ready to bring in a great message. I would have identified their felt needs and began to address them, sort of wowing them. But Jesus doesn't wow them. He sort of walks up and says, "Come, follow me, and I'll make you fish for people." And I imagine he kind of laughed after he said that. There they are, fishermen and all. I'm going to make you fish for people. And they drop everything and follow him. I mean, we are all called by God, and I think there's some common traits to these sorts of things. So notice, first of all, that the call of God is an interruption in these guys' lives. I mean, I don't think we think of it too much. We sort of make them into porcelain figurines as if it was all easy and smooth, but picture them in their context. They're at work. This is like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe for James and John, it was more like 4:30 when they were finally finishing up their work of the day and putting together their nets. And Jesus calls them in the middle of their family business to do some other kind of business. It's an interruption, and as always, Jesus interrupts our normal expectations about the way things are supposed to go. A call from God is often an interruption. My own call from God into ordained ministry, not just to ministry in general, but to ordained ministry, came when I was in college. I was studying, for some of you that might be a surprise, I was studying biology in an attempt to be a physical therapist. Most of my time, though, was spent trying to be cool, looking like an athlete, and impressing the girls. That was really sort of my agenda of what was happening in college, just to be honest. And I think probably for lots of you, similar pursuits were probably in line with those. A call to ministry that came while I was in college interrupted those things and took me on a path that I had never anticipated or particularly wanted. When these disciples were called, "Come follow me, I'll make you fish for people," they dropped everything and followed them. He spoke, they listened. He commanded, they obeyed. For me, it kind of took a while for me to understand the call, even though I'd grown up in the church and understood that all people are called by God through baptism, and that Christians are called specifically because of baptism to be God's people in the world. Yeah, I knew that. We'd heard that in the Amplified time in my church too. For most people, and certainly for me, and probably for a lot of you, I didn't feel ready. Wasn't prepared for that. So when God's call interrupts us to serve, we often feel that we're not ready. And we're tempted to interpret our excuses for why we can't answer the call as reasons, reasonable things. I wasn't particularly religious, which seemed to me to be kind of a big deal, when it was God and all. You sort of probably should have been more religious, especially more religious than I was, and therefore I was sort of disqualified from that specific calling. God doesn't seem to care much, though, about our excuses, our reasons, and sometimes even our open rebellion when God calls us and chooses us to do a specific task. God recognizes our will, gives us the freedom to reject the call, postpone the call, rebel against the call, but God is a pretty persistent pursuer. And God isn't concerned over our lack, because God isn't calling us to do it all on our own, to trust in our own readiness, to trust in our own reasons, to trust in our own ability or our own provisions. Instead, God is calling us to trust in God's provisions. That's the whole sense of what the call means, although we first look at our lack. We're all probably more like Jonah, which is what I love about the fact that they pair in the lectionary Jonah with these disciples who drop everything, so at least we have somebody that we can relate to in the story. Jonah is probably the most reluctant prophet ever. Yet God will even use him through all of his protesting. I mean, he's never willing, even when he does it. He's the worst. He gives the lowest bar for sermons, and even the lowest bar for sermons, one that is clearly wanting for homiletical excellence, and yet God uses this stinker of a sermon to convert an entire capital city. God doesn't seem to care. And Jonah's not alone. Think through some of the folks that God has called and how that works. You know, Abraham was too old to start a family. Jonah, of course, was running. Jeremiah, he was too young to be credible. Isaac was a daydreamer. Leah was overlooked. Joseph was abused. Moses was a stutterer. Gideon was afraid. Samson had long hair and a bad picker when it came to women. Rahab was a prostitute. Elijah was given to despair. Job went bankrupt. Naomi was bitter and grieving. Jacob was a cheat. David committed sexual assault and rape. Solomon was compromised. Peter denied Jesus himself. James and John fell asleep on the job. Zacchaeus was too short. Saul was a murderous zealot. Timothy had an ulcer. Isaiah preached naked. You're going to have to look that one up later. and Lazarus was dead. Some of you might have some of those reasons for being qualified or disqualified. I'm too old. I'm a stutterer. I can't speak in public. But if God didn't care about any of these people, including Lazarus, who I think has a pretty good excuse, I can't make it, I'm dead. I'm sorry, Lord. But don't care, Laz. Zot. Come and follow me. And he did. So, what's wrong with you? I've taken this aside in point 2 because it has really nothing to do with the gospel reading, because so many of us are unlike the disciples who were just willing to drop everything and move into a new direction in which God was calling us. And most of us are a little bit more like Jonah. And it's no small thing that these guys do this. These 4 particular fishermen do this. Jesus calls many, but few respond to the summons. You know, in churches, so there's this sort of a normal statistics in every church, right? 20% of the people are really involved in the life together. We call those folks the core. And then there's about 20% who are relatively faithful in worship. They come each week, but they really don't get involved in much else, and you can't count on them for much else other than kind of a regular worship time, which is great. And they're sort of the community of the church beyond the core, and sometimes they will come in and out of the core. And there's another 20% who are sort of sporadic members, who are part of the congregation. And then there's the 40% more. If I did my math, I had to go back and check it to make sure I had less than 100%. Some of you are counting in your head. I can see it already. I can see it. I'm way below 100 so far. Another 40% who are sort of the matched and dispatched sort of folks who come in and out of the church based on what their needs are. They're sort of the wider community, but there's sort of a nominal approach to the church, and certainly not a commitment to that, and not a lot of financial support, and certainly not a weekly kind of attendance. So the fact that the first disciples were willing to jump from like way out in the community end, in fact, so far out, they're actually in the water, that's how far they were, that they immediately say yes to the master, and they leave their nets and follow him. It's no small matter. I mean, this is really having the rubber hit the road. I read an interesting article some years ago about an African tribe, Mbuti men, who are of Central Africa. They're also called pygmies, which is probably what I'm going to call them from now on, since I can't pronounce Mbuti. They have a unique way of making music. The men have this unique social bond. The men will whittle musical pipes out of soft wood. So it's like they're a band. But the problem with it is that each pipe can only play one note. So only one man will whittle a pipe that plays, say, like an A flat, while another person will whittle a pipe that's a D and another an F sharp and so on. And because each man can only play one note, all of them have to work together, of course, to create music. And if somebody's missing from the group, there's true diminishment from the group. There's something definitely lacking, a lack of harmony or richness that results when all the men are playing together. And I think that's a magnificent metaphor for what the church is and the investment or lack of investment that some of us often make. Imagine if every member of our fellowship was playing one note of a flute, and when we got together, you could hear those harmonies and the richness of that music, and how important we would see to each other. I mean, if these guys were in Idaho, that would be totally unacceptable. You know, we'd have to have their two notes, you know. What would happen? When someone dies, that would be true grief, right? I mean, because then you're losing like the B flat, and that's kind of or a C, you know. The C, you have to have C. No music holds together if you don't have middle C. So you see how important the community becomes to one another. The fellowship of that one note that is played can produce a symphony when they're all played together, when the yes is offered together. You know, these were kind of one-note kind of guys. These weren't symphony kind of guys. These weren't the top of the top. These were sort of ordinary folks who Jesus said, "Follow me," and they followed, and they played their note, and they offered that singular, unique part of who they were. And having said that, we have to acknowledge that there's something about being around Jesus that seems to tune people's lives in a way that makes them unique and special. Not that they aren't already are, but there's something different about the way in which we see it. As I talked to the kids this morning, what if, instead of looking at school as a drudgery, look at the place to which God has called you, the place where you will find God? And what would it be if you started looking at your workplace as a place where you would expect to see God? You might go there a little differently. It can happen to us as we're around Jesus. Christ doesn't care about our past. He doesn't care about our qualifications or our disqualifications, our abilities, our disabilities, or the fact that we can only play one good note. Christ can turn us into someone special if we'll let him, and that's the rub, right? If we will let him, if we'll get close enough to allow the note of our life to vibrate with the harmonies of his, if we let him. We're not like Peter and Andrew, James and John. We are far more educated. We're far more sophisticated. We live in nice homes. We, for the most part, have pretty good paying jobs. Most of you drive nice cars. Well, heck, they didn't even drive cars. They had a boat. That was it. We're pretty content with the circumstances the way they are. We're not really sure we want to be God's person, God's man or God's woman, if it means committing more of our time or more of our resources. We're like millions of people who have lived over this earth in this interceding 2,000 years. We would like to stay on the good side of God, but we'd like to just kind of stay at a distance too. Enough God to make us look right and acceptable and popular, but not so much that we begin to look weird. You know, when I knelt in my ordination prayer, I'll never forget it. The first thought was, I was so disqualified he was going to kill me right there, and how embarrassing that would be to my mother. I'd be dead, so it wouldn't matter. But so my first prayer was, don't kill me right here. And my second prayer, and this is just irrational stuff, I was kneeling for ordination. You know, they put the stole on. Please don't make me weird like all the other pastors I know. The things that you think about, you know. God, just enough to make me moral, you know, a nice guy that people like, but not so religious to be really funky, you know, kind of odd and obnoxious. I mean, we live in a culture where you know, people can be fanatical about stuff. Sports. I love that you're wearing That's the Vikings. I love this. You're wearing the Vikings. You know, we are allowed to be fanatical about sports. You're not the only one. Where's our SC guy? And you're not wearing. Well, you're wearing blue at least. Is he at a game? I'm sorry, he's at a game today. Couldn't make it. Perfect. But if you allow your faith to be like that, some people start to look at you sort of a little funny. I mean, if you become known as the Jesus freak, you can almost bet in our society that means kind of one thing. Sadly, that you're the most obnoxious person in the room. And that's not because it's projected on you. It's because more often than not, that's what you become. And maybe also the most hypocritical person. So it seems to me that the quality of our following has sort of tailed off into something else. You know, if you were dressed according to your priorities, we should have had a Jersey day. That would have been awesome. You know, obviously we have a Vikings fan out there along with USC fans and UCLA fans. But if you were dressed according to your priorities, how would you dress? Would it be a sports fan? Would you be a parent? Would you be a Republican or a Democrat? Would there be anything about the way you present yourself that would speak of Christ? What would the identity look like? As Terry's repeated the quote, would there be enough evidence to convict you that you are a follower of Jesus? Go with me to Southeast Asia. So at the border of Laos and Vietnam, before the Western powers put in national boundaries, the kings of Laos and Vietnam reached an agreement about taxation in this border region where you had sort of different cultures living side by side. They chose an interesting formula to decide who got whose tax money. They divided the citizens into two groups depending on how they lived. Those who ate short grain rice and built their houses on stilts and decorated them with Indian-style serpents were considered Laotians. On the other hand, those who ate long-grained rice, built their houses on the ground, and decorated them with Chinese-style dragons were considered Vietnamese. The exact locations of a person's home didn't really matter. That's not what determined whose nationality they were or where their taxation would come from. Instead, each person belonged to the kingdom whose cultural values he or she exhibited. If you lived one way, you were Laotian. If you lived another way, you were Vietnamese. Now, this is a great metaphor for what it means to be the children of God. Jesus calls us each to be followers. That doesn't mean that we just get to like him on Facebook or say that we know him or made a decision to believe in him. That's like saying that I made a decision to believe that Avery exists. Hi. Sorry, I didn't mean that pause to go quite so long where you felt like you needed to. As if somehow my acknowledgement would be the thing that made her existence so. No, it's time. It's time for a renewed form of Christianity in our country that's beyond the lefts and the rights, beyond the conservative and the liberal, beyond American even, or colonial Lutheranism. It can begin whenever we hear Jesus' words for these disciples to come to us again. Come and follow me. And to receive that interruption. And to hear all of our reasons, mostly excuses. And to just put our feet into his footsteps. And to watch him. And to learn from him. To become a student, or as Dallas Willard says, an apprentice of Jesus. You know, not just somebody who says, yeah, I know he exists, but to actually, like an apprentice, to follow and mimic the actions of, so that we become more and more like the master, so that one day we have mastered those skills, but there's always the master ahead of us, you know. And then people would line up behind us saying, oh, well, he seems to be able to do that, or she seems to be able to do that. Let's put our footsteps into those footsteps. And so we would follow him into things like, well, conversations. We would follow Jesus into conversations like his. And we'd follow him into compassion for the needy. And we'd follow him to the margins and to those that the church and the world reject. And we'd follow him to the halls of power. And we'd follow him into politics of the day. And therefore, our day. And we'd follow him into the darkest places to bring light. And we'd follow him into the deadest places to bring life. And into the deadliest places to offer ourselves. And into society again, to bring a word of compassion for the stranger, for the needy, for the poor, for the outcast, the lost, and a word of warning to the greedy, the powerful, and the selfish. You see, if we'll take these steps into the steps of Jesus and follow him, well, it will be political, but probably not your current politic or mine. And it will be controversial because you will fight for people that nobody will fight for, and love people who no one will love, and care for people that other people want to label or villainize or disregard. And you will step into the footsteps of life and renewal and friendship and love of God and loving care of your neighbor, and into the power of God to overturn death with life. And this is what made Christianity such a winning concept in the Roman Empire, who would kill their Messiah. Within 300 years, Christianity takes over the Roman Empire, the empire that persecuted them, the empire that threw them into the lions, the empire that made them be really bad fighters. It would be because in the 4th century, 3rd and 4th century, the Christians made their way to Rome, and during the plagues, the Christians didn't run away. And in fact, the Christians bought land outside the city, and then they would go into the city and they would pick up the dead, and they would take the dead out of the towns and bury them in the ground. And there is an exchange between the Roman emperor who had fled the city and his physician who had to stay behind. And there's a note about these crazy people who seem to have utter contempt for death, as if death doesn't apply to them because of resurrection. And eventually he says they call themselves Christians. Is forming a cemetery political? I suppose in somebody's book. But it's doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons to be helpful to the world. Is there anything highly theological about buying a cemetery? Not particularly. I mean, I don't know. I guess we could build one around it. But it was what was needed. And hospice was what was needed for those who were sick and dying. And that's what the church was willing to do, to act with contempt toward the forces of death, to act with contempt toward the voices of violence and evil and division, and to step into the breach of those experiences and to bring with them life and healing. And yes, a lot of self-sacrifice, but to be willing to give yourselves, because that's where you see the footprints of Jesus going, and we've got to keep up with him, because if he pulls away, life will lose its meaning. We have to stay in his footsteps. We have to keep following him into an adventure of following. Not perfect belief, folks. The early church, it was wildly diverse belief. Nobody agreed with each other about all sorts of things. But it was beyond those beliefs into actions, whole lives that were committed. And that's kind of where our second lesson drops us, this weird little snippet of 1 Corinthians 7. It's really about committing our whole lives. You know, St. Paul the Bachelor giving marriage advice. If I went home and said, honey, today we're going to live like we are not married, I'm not sure that would go over, whether it was apocalyptic or the end of the world or not. It might be the end of the world for me. But what Paul's trying to drive at there is not marriage advice. It's our approach to the world. Like today's the day. Act like this is the most important moment, because Jesus' footsteps are right in front of us. And he's going to turn around one day, and suddenly we're going to see him face to face, and not just the wet steps in the sand that we're trying to keep up with, but he's going to be there. And so we have to be ready and vigilant. And so this advice in 1 Corinthians 7 this morning tells us our whole lives have to be marked by this kind of faithfulness, this kind of watching for Jesus' footsteps into the world, and to not let other things, football or politics, lust, that's really what the passage is about, dictate who we are or whose we are, because we belong to him. Whose cultural values does your life exhibit? The kingdom of this world or the kingdom of God? Christ is beckoning us to a different kind of life. He's calling you to be a special kind of person, a person that looks at life in a unique way with expectancy and hopefulness, and to look for the feet of Jesus in the most surprising and sometimes the most difficult and the most life-sucking sorts of ways in order to give life to those experiences again. He's calling you to live into the kingdom of life, a life lived with fellowship with those who are trying to follow those footsteps. Will you help this church try to follow into those footsteps, discerning through Scripture where they might be and continuing doggedly to pursue them? Will you heed his call? When he does, and he will, say to you, come, follow me. Amen.